The courtroom air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, cheap polish, and the quiet desperation of a dozen lives waiting to be judged. It was a place of forced reverence where whispers died and coughs were stifled. On the elevated bench, Judge Albright surveyed his domain. He was a young man, sharp in his black robes, his face set in a mask of stern importance that he had practiced in the mirror. His gaze fell upon the old man standing before him, and his lips tightened in a sneer of impatience. "Are we quite finished with this charade, Mr. Grant?" Albright's voice was crisp, cutting through the silence. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that savored its own authority. Douglas Grant did not answer immediately. He stood straight, his 86-year-old frame unexpectedly erect. His suit, though clean and pressed, was dated, a relic from a time when things were made to last. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on the defendant's lectern before him. They were still hands, patient hands. He looked at the judge, his eyes a pale, clear blue, and in their depths was a calmness that seemed to unnerve the younger man on the bench. "Your Honor," Douglas began, his voice a low, gravelly timbre, "I was merely trying to explain the circumstances of the citation." "The circumstances are irrelevant," Albright snapped, leaning forward into his microphone, the electronic amplification making his voice sound unnaturally loud and aggressive. "The officer's report states you made an illegal U-turn. It is a simple matter. You pay the fine, you accept the points on your license, and we move on. This is a courtroom, not a social club for the elderly to reminisce about the good old days." A nervous titter rippled through the handful of spectators. The prosecutor, a harried woman in her late 30s, shifted her files, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She had seen Judge Albright in this mood before. It was a performance, a display of dominance for the benefit of no one but himself. Douglas Grant's expression did not change. "With respect, Your Honor, the turn was necessary. A young child had run into the street after a ball. I turned to block any oncoming traffic from the other direction. The officer did not see the child, only my vehicle." "A child," Albright repeated, his tone dripping with theatrical disbelief. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "How convenient. A phantom child. I suppose this child vanished into thin air the moment the officer approached your window." "He ran back to his mother on the sidewalk, sir. She was quite shaken. I believe she would be willing to testify." "No, she would not be willing to testify," the judge interrupted, his voice rising, "because this is not a capital murder trial. It is a traffic violation. A simple, straightforward matter that you, for reasons I can only attribute to senility or sheer obstinance, are determined to drag out into a 3-act play. Now, for the last time, how do you plead?" A heavy silence descended. Douglas looked down at the polished wood of the lectern. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. The bailiff, a burly man with a bored expression, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting on his hip near his sidearm. "I cannot, in good conscience, plead guilty to an infraction I committed to prevent a child from being harmed," Douglas said, his voice quiet but firm. "Therefore, I must plead not guilty." Judge Albright's face flushed a deep, mottled red. It was the color of pure, unadulterated rage. He saw the old man's calm refusal not as a matter of principle, but as a direct challenge to his authority, a personal insult delivered in his own sanctum. He slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "That is it," he roared. "I have had enough of this insolence. I have given you every opportunity to resolve this matter with dignity, and you have thrown it back in my face. You waste this court's time, you invent fanciful stories, and you display a contemptuous attitude that will not be tolerated." He pointed a trembling finger at Douglas. "I find you in contempt of court." The prosecutor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. This was a catastrophic escalation for a simple traffic ticket. "Your Honor, perhaps if we took a brief recess," she began, rising slightly from her seat. "Sit down, counsel," Albright bellowed. "This man needs to be taught a lesson about respect. He needs to understand that in this room my word is law." He turned his furious gaze to the bailiff. "Bailiff, take this man into custody. Place him in handcuffs." The order hung in the air, stunning the courtroom into absolute silence. The bailiff, who had been half asleep moments before, was now rigid with attention. He looked from the judge to the old man, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had cuffed hundreds of people in his career, but they were usually angry, loud, or desperate. This old man was none of those things. He was simply still. But an order was an order. With a resigned sigh, the bailiff unclipped the cold, heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click of the ratchet echoed in the vast, silent room. He walked around the prosecutor's table and approached the defendant's lectern. "Sir," the bailiff said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I need you to place your hands behind your back." Douglas Grant did not protest. He did not argue. He simply turned, a slow, deliberate movement, and presented his wrists. His calm compliance was somehow more unnerving than any struggle would have been. He seemed to accept the humiliation as if it were a coat being placed over his shoulders. As the bailiff brought the cold metal to his skin, Douglas looked down at his own hands. The judge saw them as the hands of a feeble old man, but Douglas saw something else. For a fleeting moment, the courtroom, the judge, the bailiff, all of it faded away, replaced by a flash of memory so vivid it stole his breath. He felt not the cold steel of handcuffs but the frozen metal of an M1 rifle, his fingers so numb in the biting Korean winter he could barely feel the trigger. He remembered these same hands packing snow into a wound on a friend's leg, the pristine white turning crimson in seconds. He remembered the desperate grip of another young soldier, pulling him from the mud of a trench during a mortar barrage, the strength in that grip a lifeline in a world of chaos. He felt the weight of a field radio's handset, his knuckles white as he called in coordinates, the lives of his entire company resting on the clarity of his voice. These hands had built bridges and dug graves. They had held letters from home and photographs of faces he would never see again. They were not the hands of a criminal. They were the hands of a survivor. They were a map of his life, a testament to a history the judge could not possibly comprehend. The sharp, definitive click of the handcuffs locking into place brought him back to the present. The cold metal bit into his thin, wrinkled skin. The indignity of it was a physical weight. In the back of the courtroom, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She was a junior associate at a large law firm downtown, here only to observe proceedings in a different case that had been postponed. She had been about to leave when Douglas Grant's case was called. Something about the old man's quiet dignity had held her there. Now she was witnessing a gross abuse of power, a slow-motion car crash of justice. The sight of the handcuffs on that old veteran was too much. It felt profane. Her own grandfather had been a Marine, a man of few words and immense integrity. Just like the man standing before the judge, she knew that stillness. It wasn't weakness. It was a form of strength most people never had to learn. While Judge Albright launched into a self-righteous tirade about order in the court, Sarah slipped out of the heavy wooden doors. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her purse. She didn't call the local news. She scrolled through her contacts to a number she hadn't called in years, a number her grandfather had made her save under the name in case of emergency. It was the direct line to a retired command sergeant major who now ran a rapid response veteran advocacy network. Her call was answered on the second ring. Henderson. The voice was gruff, no nonsense. Mr. Henderson, my name is Sarah Jenkins. My grandfather was Master Sergeant Robert Jenkins. He told me to call this number if I ever saw a brother in trouble. What kind of trouble? Henderson's voice sharpened with interest. There's a veteran here, in the county courthouse, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with urgency. An elderly man. The judge. He's completely out of control. He's found him in contempt for pleading not guilty to a traffic ticket. He's had him handcuffed. In the courtroom. His name is Douglas Grant. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Douglas Grant? Henderson repeated, the name sounding strange in his mouth. Are you sure? Yes, that's what the clerk called him. Douglas Grant. He looks to be in his 80s. He's just standing there, letting it happen. The judge is talking about ordering a psychiatric evaluation now. You have to do something. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, charged. Sarah could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clicking frantically in the background. Ma'am, Henderson said, his voice now devoid of its earlier gruffness, replaced by a tone of utter bone-chilling seriousness. What is the courtroom number? Sarah told him. Stay there, Henderson commanded. Do not let them take him out of that room. If they try, cause a scene. Do whatever you have to do. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Inside a sprawling office at Fort Moore, Command Sergeant Major Henderson stood up from his desk so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. He stared at the name he had just typed into a secure military database. The file that came up was sparse, heavily redacted, but what was visible made his blood run cold. There were symbols he recognized instantly, markers of valor and clearance levels reserved for a select, almost mythical class of soldier. He didn't hesitate. He strode out of his office and down the hall, bypassing 3 layers of aides and secretaries, and burst through the heavy oak doors of the base commander's office without knocking. General Marcus Thorne, a man whose calm demeanor was legendary throughout the army, was in the middle of a video conference with the Pentagon. He looked up, his eyes flashing with annoyance at the interruption. Henderson walked directly to the desk, his face pale. He didn't speak. He simply turned his tablet around, his finger pointing at the name on the screen. Douglas C. Grant, Col Rit Teal, where, below the name was a single, iconic symbol, a 5-pointed star suspended from a blue ribbon, the Medal of Honor. General Thorne stared at the screen. The voices from the Pentagon video feed faded into meaningless noise. A memory surfaced, a story he'd heard as a young cadet at West Point. A legend whispered in hushed, reverent tones about a man they called the Ghost of Chosen, a young captain who held a crucial hilltop pass alone for 36 hours against overwhelming odds, a man who refused a battlefield commission to stay with his men, a man who was thought to have died decades ago. The general slowly rose from his chair, his massive frame radiating a sudden intense energy. He looked at Henderson. Where? County courthouse. Downtown. A traffic violation, Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper. A judge has him in handcuffs. General Thorne's face became a granite mask of fury. He terminated the Pentagon call without a word of explanation, leaving a 4-star general in Washington staring at a blank screen. "Get my car," he commanded, his voice a low growl, "and get me my full dress uniform. Now." Back in the courtroom, Judge Albright was basking in the restored silence, the absolute submission of everyone in the room. The old man stood, cuffed and shamed. The judge felt a surge of satisfaction. He had reasserted his dominance. "Now, for the final blow. Given your clear disconnect from reality, Mr. Grant," Albright announced, his voice oozing a false clinical concern, "I have no choice but to question your competency. Your obstinance and nonsensical stories about phantom children suggest you may be a danger to yourself and the public. I am therefore ordering you to be remanded into custody and held for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation at the state hospital." It was the ultimate humiliation. He was stripping the man not only of his liberty but of his very sanity. The prosecutor closed her eyes, mortified. The bailiff flinched. This was no longer justice, it was a public execution of a man's dignity. It was at that precise moment that the grand double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. They didn't fly open with a crash. They opened with a quiet, deliberate authority as if pushed by an invisible, unstoppable force. 2 men stood framed in the doorway. They were not police officers or court officials. They were soldiers, both in the immaculate, razor-creased formal attire of the United States Army dress blues. One was a younger captain, his face stern and unreadable. The other was a giant. General Marcus Thorne stood over 6 feet 4 inches tall, his chest a billboard of colored ribbons, his shoulders heavy with the 4 silver stars of his rank. His presence was so commanding, so utterly out of place in the shabby courtroom, that it seemed to suck all the air from the room. The low hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed deafening in the absolute, stunned silence that followed. Judge Albright stared, his mouth slightly agape. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier booming confidence. "This is a court of law. You have no jurisdiction here." General Thorne ignored him completely. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the room and settled on the old man in handcuffs. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened into something that looked like cold, righteous fury. He began to walk down the central aisle. His polished black shoes made no sound on the worn linoleum floor. The captain followed a respectful 2 paces behind. The entire courtroom, the spectators, the lawyers, the clerk, all turned to watch this slow, silent procession. It felt like a scene from a movie, too dramatic to be real. The general did not stop at the bar separating the gallery from the court. He didn't stop at the prosecutor's table. He walked directly up to the defendant's lectern and stood before Douglas Grant. For a moment the 2 men, the 4-star general in all his glory, and the humbled old man in his rumpled suit and handcuffs, simply looked at each other. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, General Thorne snapped to attention. He raised his right hand in the crispest, most reverent salute the courtroom had ever witnessed. It was not a gesture for the judge or the crowd. It was a salute of profound respect, from one soldier to another. He held it, his arm as steady as a marble column. He lowered his hand and finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated with power and emotion. "Colonel Douglas Grant, sir," he said, the title Colonel landing like a thunderclap in the silent room. "General Marcus Thorne. It is an honor, sir." He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon the handcuffs on Colonel Grant's wrists. The general's jaw muscle clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Judge Albright, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Bailiff," the general said, his voice dangerously calm, "you will remove those restraints from this man, now." The bailiff, sweating freely, fumbled for his key. He practically scrambled to unlock the cuffs, murmuring, sorry sir, under his breath. The cuffs fell away with a soft clatter. Douglas Grant rubbed his wrists, a faint red mark circling each one. He looked at the general. Thank you, son, he said quietly. No, sir, General Thorne replied, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. He turned fully to face the bench, and the full, unshielded force of his fury was directed at the man in the black robe. Judge Albright, he began, I am not a lawyer, but I am a student of history, and I am looking at a man who is a living, breathing piece of it. His aide, the captain, stepped forward and handed him a slim folder. The general opened it. This court has accused Colonel Douglas Grant of fabricating stories, the general said, his voice rising with each word. So let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about a 22-year-old first lieutenant in the winter of 1950 at a place called the Chosin Reservoir. Let me tell you about a man who, after his company commander was killed, took command of a rifle company of 80 men and held a strategic mountain pass against a force of over 2,000 enemy soldiers. For 2 days and 2 nights, in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero, he repelled wave after wave of attacks. The courtroom was mesmerized. The spectators were leaning forward, some with tears welling in their eyes. Sarah Jenkins stood in the back, her hand covering her mouth. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. For these actions, President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor, this nation's highest award for valor, an award he never talks about, an award he felt he didn't deserve because, in his words, the real heroes never came home. General Thorne closed the folder with a sharp snap. This man, this insolent old man you have seen fit to humiliate, to handcuff, to threaten with psychiatric evaluation over a traffic ticket he got while trying to protect a child, is one of the greatest heroes this nation has ever produced. And you, in your arrogance and your ignorance, have treated him with less respect than a common criminal. You are a disgrace to that robe. You are a stain on the very concept of justice this man fought to defend. The rebuke was total, absolute, and devastating. Judge Albright had shrunk in his chair. The mask of authority had shattered, revealing the small, petty man beneath. He was white as a sheet, his hands trembling. All eyes turned to Douglas Grant. The silence stretched, waiting for him to speak, to rage, to demand retribution. He did none of those things. He simply looked at the judge, not with anger but with a profound and weary sadness. The weight of that robe is heavier than you think, son, Douglas said, his voice gentle. It's meant to serve justice, not ego. Remember that. As he spoke, he unconsciously touched a small, simple pin on his lapel, a pin no one had noticed before, and for a second, another memory flashed. Not of battle, but of its aftermath. He was in a field hospital, a young man again. His best friend, a boy from Ohio named Sammy, was lying on a cot, his breathing shallow. Sammy had pressed something small and hard into his hand. It was this pin, a tiny St. Christopher medal. You go live a good, quiet life for both of us, Doug, Sammy had whispered with his last breath. A quiet life. And that was the promise Douglas Grant had spent the next 65 years keeping. He never sought recognition. He never told his stories. He had simply tried to live a quiet life. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By the time General Thorne personally escorted Colonel Grant from the courthouse, news crews were already swarming the entrance. The story was the lead on every national news network that evening. The Judicial Conduct Commission announced a full investigation into Judge Albright's conduct before the courthouse had even closed for the day. He was suspended indefinitely. A few weeks later, a man in a rumpled polo shirt walked into a small, quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. He ordered a black coffee and scanned the room. He saw Douglas Grant sitting by the window, reading a newspaper, a half-eaten muffin on a plate beside him. The man, former Judge Albright, hesitated for a long moment. Then he took a deep breath and walked over to the table. "Colonel Grant," he said, his voice barely audible. Douglas looked up from his paper, his blue eyes calm and questioning. I wanted to apologize," Albright stammered, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. "What I did, there's no excuse for it. I was arrogant. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Douglas Grant looked at the man before him, a man stripped of his power and his pride. He saw not an enemy, but just a person who had lost his way. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance. "We all make mistakes, son," he said. "The important thing is to learn from them." He folded his newspaper and took a sip of his coffee. A quiet man living a quiet life, his duty at long last done. If this story of quiet valor and overdue justice moved you, show your support by liking this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more true stories of unassuming heroes.